4 times, 10 days I've passed, wandering this woody maze. We're back to the maze again of Paradise Lost. And human food not tasted, nor had appetite. That fast to virtue I impute not, or count part of what I suffer here. If nature need not, or God support nature without repasts, though needing, what praise is it to endure? In other words, he says it. I have been going without food for 40 days, but I'm not ready to celebrate that fact, right? In other words, humility. But now, he says, I feel I hunger, which declares nature hath need of what she asks. Yet God can satisfy that need some other way, though hunger still remain. We think, of course, of the important role that Job will play here. Notice, in other words, the Son of God, Christ, is saying, I'm suffering, I'm hungry, but I will have faith that God will provide. So it remain without this body's wasting. I content me, and from the sting of famine fear no harm, nor mind it, fed with better thoughts that feed me, hungering more to do my Father's will. We think of John 4:34 in that passage where ostensibly Milton is playing that game as well, right? So then at line 260, he decides to go to sleep. He has a dream. And in that dream, up a hill he goes, line 285, up to a hill, and on his steps he reared, from whose high top to kin the prospect round, if cottage were in view, sharp coat or herd. But cottage, herd, or sheep coat, none he saw. In other words, ain't nothing up there. We're in the middle of the wilderness, right? Only in a bottom saw a pleasant grove with chaunt of tuneful birds resounding loud, looks down off the hill, sees a beautiful grove, and decides, you know what, I'm going to go down there, and I'm going to see what I can see. At line 298, all of a sudden he sees a man before him. Not rustic as before, but seemlier clad. So he sees a rich man dressed up, as if, of course, the Son of God isn't going to note that this is obviously the next temptation of the devil, right? As one in city or court or palace bred, and with fair speech these words to him addressed. And at line 302 to 316, we have this really remarkable speech. Now, obviously, this is extra-biblical, but we have this really remarkable speech by Satan. Let's take a look at it. With granted leave, officious I return, but much more wonder that the Son of God in this wild solitude so long would bide. Of all things destitute, and well I know, not without hunger. In other words, he says it. I know that you've been without food for a long time, and I know you're hungry. Others of some notice, story tells, have trod this wilderness. He says, I know a lot of people have been through this wilderness. Now, let's point out for your notes, this is, of course, wilderness as both literal and metaphor. In Harvard Classics, in fact, we will have a chance to talk about Pilgrim's Progress, a really important Christian epic that will play the same game of the long journey through the wilderness. And the wilderness, of course, is going to have all those different obstacles for those of you who are O Brother, Where Art Thou fans, right? As story tells, have trod this wilderness, the fugitive bondwoman with her son. Of course, we're thinking here of Hagar in the Genesis 21, 8 through 21 account. Outcast Naboth, the son of Hagar, Ishmael, yet found here relief by a providing angel. All the race of Israel here have famished, had not God rained from heaven manna. In other words, this is just like where the wilderness, where the children of Israel, after the Exodus, all would have died if it hadn't been for manna from heaven. And that prophet bold, native of Thebes, wandering here, we're thinking again, of course, of Elijah, was fed twice by a voice inviting him to eat, right? Of thee, these 40 days, none have regard. 40 and more deserted here indeed. In other words, wow, so you're doing very similar to what others have done in regards to going for long periods of time without sustenance. At line 316, Jesus replies, what concludest thou hence? In other words, what's the point you're making? They all had need. They were all lost and in need. I, as thou seest, have none. Now, this is, of course, another way for Milton to point out that Christ is the living embodiment of faith, as we might say it, right? And Satan will then continue at line 319 and following, 319 to 327 is going to be his argument. You should eat. Satan replies, how hast thou hunger then? Tell me, if food were now before thee set, wouldst thou not eat? Thereafter, as I like the giver, answered Jesus. Why should that cause thy refusal, said the subtle fiend, right? In other words, Jesus says, I'll eat when the giver, God, gives it to me, right? Now, of course, for those of you who know Lois Lowry's novel, the giver, the reference here, of course. God is the giver, right? Hast thou not right, said the subtle fiend, to all created things? Owe not all creatures by just right to thee, duty and service, not to say till bid but tender all their power? Nor mention I meats by the law unclean, or offered first to idols, those young Daniel could refuse, nor proffered by an enemy, though who could scruple that with want oppressed? In other words, he says, this is not illegal to have something to eat. Why don't you go ahead and just eat? And then at line 340, we have a table richly spread in regal mode, with dishes piled and meats of noblest sort and savour, beasts of chase or fowl of game and pastry built. In other words, Satan will put in front of Christ, who is starving, hungry, 40 days without eating, a beautiful table of food, and he will offer it to him, a rich table. Line 349, we're told that this is a much nicer table than that crude apple that diverted Eve. In other words, this is a serious temptation, right? At line 368, he will come back now to challenge the Son of God to sit down and eat. Let's read it, 368 to 377. What doubts the Son of God to sit and eat? Why don't you sit down and eat? These are not fruits forbidden, no interdicted fins, the touching of these viands pure. Their taste no knowledge works, at least of evil, but life preserves, destroys life's enemy. In other words, you should eat, you're hungry. Hunger with sweet restorative delight. All these are spirits of air and woods and springs, thy gentle ministers who come to pay thee homage and acknowledge thee, their Lord. What doubtest thou, Son of God? And then lines 377, sit down and eat. Well, at line 378, then sit down and eat, 377, 378, Christ will then respond. And he will say it this way. Christ temperately replied, saidest thou not that to all things I had right? And who withholds my power that right to use? Shall I receive by gift what of my own, when and where likes me best I can command? If I wanted to, he says, I could command, and a table of beautiful food could be brought up. I can at will, doubt not, as soon as thou command a table in this wilderness, and call swift flights of angels, miscreant, arrayed in glory, on my cup to attend. The significance of the word my cup is huge for Milton, because of course in that third part of that story of the Christ story, as we were emphasizing it, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, before the death, of course, there is that famous Garden of Gethsemane scene where Christ will ask that this cup somehow not be one he has to drink. Here he says, angels will take care of my cup. Why shouldest thou then obtrude this diligence in vain, where no acceptance it can be found? And with my hunger, what hast thou to do? The pompous delicacies I condemn, and count thy specious gifts no gifts, but guiles. Now, of course, we can't miss this for our notes. This is huge. Milton will have Christ say what Eve should have said. Your gifts are tricks. Guiles, in other words. Right? Satan's response at line 392 is fascinating. He says, that I have also power to give, thou sayest. If of that power I bring thee voluntary, what I might have bestowed on whom I pleased. In other words, he says it. I can give my power to anybody. And now we're beginning to move towards, of course, that Luke 4 second temptation, aren't we, right? At line 406 to 431, we will see Satan's next trap, his temptation. By hunger that each other creature tames, thou art not to be harmed, therefore not moved. Thy temperance invisible besides, for no allurement yields to appetite. Right? He says it. And all thy heart is set on high designs, high actions, but wherewith to be achieved. Great acts require great means of enterprise. Thou art unknown, unfriended, low of birth, a carpenter thy father known, thyself bred up in poverty, and straits at home, lost in a desert, here and hunger bit. Which way, or from what hope dost thou aspire to greatness? Whence authority derivest? What followers, what retinue canst thou gain? Or at thy heels the dizzy multitude longer than thou canst feed them on thy cost? Money brings honor, friends, conquest, and realms. right? In other words, he asks the interesting question, what is it that leads men to greatness? Answer, money and power. We immediately, of course, think of Machiavelli's Prince, right? Who raised Antipater the Edomite and his son Herod, the two who are, of course, now governing in Judea, placed on Judea's throne? Thy power, thy throne, but gold hath got him puissant friends, powerful friends. In other words, if you want powerful friends, you need to have money. I can help that happen. I can help you to gain the power. Therefore, if at great things thou wouldst derive, get riches. And we immediately, of course, think, don't we, of Iago speaking to Rodrigo in Othello 1:3, right? Put money in thy purse. Get riches. First get wealth and treasure heap. Not difficult if thou hearken to me. Riches are mine. Fortune is at my hand. They whom I favor thrive in wealth amain, while virtue, valor, wisdom sit in want. In other words, at line 431, 432, I can give you the things that you need to have the power that you want to run the world, if you will. Of course, at line 453, we're going to get this great response, Christ's response, starting at 432. Let's go there now. To whom thus Jesus patiently replied, yet wealth without these three, namely virtue, valor, wisdom, is impotent. Let's read that line again, because it's an important point that Milton is wanting to make. It doesn't matter if you have wealth if you don't have virtue, valor, and wisdom. Of course, we think of the virtue, valor, and wisdom as those Platonic cardinal virtues come to mind from Republic, don't they, right? In Republic 4. Yet wealth without these three is impotent to gain dominion or to keep it gained. Witness those ancient empires of the earth in height of all their flowing wealth dissolved. In other words, all you got to do is study history to see that there's been wealthy nations and wealthy people, and it didn't help them. He mentions, for example, Gideon. Judges 6:15 comes to mind. Jephthah, Judges 11 comes to mind. The shepherd lad David, Psalm 78, 70 through 71, all come to mind. Whose offspring on the throne of Judah sat so many years and shall yet regain that seat and regain in Israel without end. Line 442. In other words, just because you don't have bank, money, does not mean that you can't be powerful. And then at line 453, he will continue to finish this. Extol not riches, then the toil of fools, the wise man's cumbrance, if not snare, more apt to slacken virtue and abate her edge, than prompt her to do aught may merit praise. Money can be a downfall, having aught of it. What if, with like aversion, I reject riches and realms, yet not for that a crown, golden in its show, is but a wreath of thorns, brings dangers, troubles, cares, and sleepless nights to him who wears the regal diadem, when on his shoulders each man's burden lies, and therein stands the office of a king, his honor, virtue, merit, and chief praise, that for the public all this weight he bears. It's interesting that he would say, some people will change a golden crown for a crown of thorns. Of course, Milton making his point, right? You got it. That in the end, Christ will be crucified with a crown of thorns around his head. Yeah, just to finish. He who reigns within himself and rules passions. The final lines of Book 2. Watch it. He who reigns within himself. We think of Proverbs 15:32, of course, but we also think of Plato's Republic here, right? He who reigns within himself, temperance, discipline, and rules passions, desires, and fears, is more a king, which every wise and virtuous man attains, and who attains not, ill aspires to rule cities of men, or headstrong multitudes, subject himself to anarchy within. We think, of course, of, again, Plato's Republic, Book 8-9, declension of state argument, or lawless passions in him which he serves, but to guide nations in the way of truth, by saving doctrine, and from error lead to know. We're back to knowledge. And knowing worship God aright is yet more kingly. Let's put it in our notes. This will be one of the major messages of Book 2. It's powerful stuff. Think about it, what he says. There's two kinds of rich men and rich women. There are people who have wealth as in physical wealth, and then there are people who have the riches that will allow them the knowledge they need to live their life well, wisdom. This attracts the soul, governs the inner man, the nobler part. That other, or the body, only reigns, and oft by force, which to a generous mind so reigning can be no secure delay. In other words, you can actually be happier. We're back to, of course, Plato's argument in Book 9 of Republic that the just man is actually a happier person, right? Besides, to give a kingdom hath been thought greater and nobler done, and to lay down far more magnanimous than to assume riches are needless, then both for themselves and for thy reason why they should be sought, to gain a scepter, oftenest better missed. In other words, the Son of God will say, I am not here to be an earthly king. I do not want to run the world. The ironies, of course, will be that Christian theologians have pointed out for a long time that, in fact, after Christian theology began to take over Europe and much of the world, there was tremendous power by kings who were, of course, Christian. But Christ himself here will make the point, I don't need money and power to do the thing I've got to do. All right, let's finish now quickly at level 2A, messages, themes. Obviously, one of them is this question of who is rich. Remember what Thoreau said, a man is rich in proportion to the things he can live without in Walden, right? This is going to be one of those interesting debates. How about this one? For message theme. There are lots of different kinds of hunger, right? There's hunger that's physical, there's hunger that's spiritual. Or how about this one? To be a king. What does it mean to be royalty? Well, here notice it is self-discipline, sounding very much like Plato's Republic. We also think of Marcus Aurelius. Go back and look at my lecture in Harvard Classics, number 9. To be a good man, even in a palace. Remember he said one can do it, one can do it. We think of Epictetus as well, don't we, right? All right, let's go to level 2B in rhetoric. Notice how Paradise Regained Book 2 is an addition to the Luke 4 story, the account, and yet it is a powerful statement of what it means to be disciplined. A man who has starved for 40 days is going to turn down food because he has a greater interest, a higher interest. Of course, like the Platonic dialogues, we have an interesting exchange. The question, of course, is who is the true man? Who is the happy man? Who is the powerful man? This sounds very much like, of course, any number of Platonic dialogues that we could mention. We go back, for example, to Phaedo and that idea of what does it mean to have lived a good life so that you can die a good life? Finally, notice the powerful symbolism that will happen in Paradise Regained 2, in Book 2. A rich meal, sumptuous meal in the middle of the wilderness, a crown and what that crown signifies, both, of course, a golden diadem or crown and, of course, the crown of thorns. At level 3A, how can we relate this to other texts? We've mentioned several already, but I just want to mention Plato's Apology. I gave the lecture in Harvard Classics number 5. Go and take a look at that one. Socrates, remember, will hate the sophists. Why? Well, for one thing, because they take money. He says, I refuse to take money. I don't need money. Money is not the way that I understand what is important to me. We, of course, think of that Gita 2 passage from the Bhagavad Gita. You have the right to work, but for the work's sake only. You have no right to the fruits of your labor. Desire for the fruits must never be your motive in working. Never give way to laziness either. It's an interesting idea. If you work for the money, if you work for the Scooby Snack, if you work for the treasure, if you work for the reward, if you do things for the compliment, sooner or later you're going to become unhappy about that. We think, of course, of Marx and his critique of capitalism, don't we? This is a fascinating way to take a look at Paradise Regained Book 2. Think of the American transcendentalist tradition. I've already mentioned Thoreau, but also Emerson as well. This notion that you don't need money, but you do need to understand what are the essentials in your life. What is for you your favorite text that teaches what really matters, the thing that really matters, right? Finally, at level 3A, how are you going to relate this to yourself? Well, there's a few questions here. How about this one? What is your view of hunger? When was the last time you were really hungry? And of course, that notion about there's different ways to understand hunger. Remember that story about the kid who wants to learn from the great master? The master takes him down to the water, dunks him under the water and holds him there. The kid thinks he's going to drown and he starts fighting for air. And of course the master will say, when you are as hungry for knowledge as you were as hungry for air, then I'm ready to teach you. It's a compelling word picture. What about feeding your hunger, your desires? Is it always a good thing? Or should you show self-discipline? How about this one? What was a time in your life that you're happy with yourself for showing some discipline? If you will, to work with the word picture, you had the sumptive table in front of you and you walked away because you recognized it was not good for you. What was a time you didn't show that level of self-control, right? And you kind of maybe wish that you had, right? What is finally for you the hardest temptation, right, for you to avoid? And why is that? Can we at all analyze the powers of addiction and addictive behavior from a study of this? I think we can, and I think Milton was very much wanting us to as well. Well, let's turn now. We'll continue right into it again with Book 3 of Paradise Regained. We are now halfway through this epic, so obviously it's a lot shorter epic than Paradise Lost, but I think just as compelling. Come back and we'll take a look at the next major temptation now that the devil, Satan, will give to Christ, Matthew and Luke 4. Thank you.